She woke up before the sun, the alarm dragging her out of a short, restless sleep. Her apartment was small and barely furnished, the walls bare except for a few old photographs of her family. She had lived here for a year, saving every penny she could, always careful with money because she knew that every dollar counted. Today would be like every other day, filled with long hours and heavy trays, her hands moving quickly to keep the guests happy while trying not to let the exhaustion show. She dressed in her uniform, a plain black skirt and white blouse, making sure her hair was neat, her shoes polished, and her name tag straight. She looked in the mirror and forced a smile, reminding herself that she could do this. She could survive another day. The hotel was already bustling when she arrived. The lobby smelled of fresh flowers and coffee, the soft hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of glasses and silverware. She passed by the concierge, who nodded at her without a word, and moved quickly toward the kitchen to pick up her first tray of drinks. The morning shift was calm compared to the evenings, but it required a kind of energy that she had learned to summon from deep inside herself. She balanced the trays with precision, moving through the room with a practiced ease, avoiding collisions and smiling at guests who barely looked her way. Most people saw her as nothing more than someone who took their orders and carried their food. Few noticed her eyes, which were always alert, always watching, taking in every detail of the room, the people, and the way the world moved around her. She had been working at this hotel for several years now. It was not glamorous, and it did not pay well, but it kept a roof over her head and food on her table. Her co-workers treated her as part of the background, a person who moved like a shadow between the tables. There was a quiet dignity in her work, a pride that no one seemed to notice. She did not complain, because she knew the world was not kind to those who did. She kept her head down and her heart quiet, and she did her job as best as she could. But there was another part of her life, one that she carried in secret. Behind the walls of this hotel, near the corner of the Grand Lounge, stood a magnificent piano. It was old, but beautiful. Polished wood that reflected the soft light from the chandeliers above. To most people, it was just another decoration, a symbol of wealth and elegance. But to her, it was a place of escape, a place where she could be herself, a place where she could speak without words. She arrived early most mornings, before the hotel was crowded, and sat at the piano, letting her fingers dance across the keys. The music that came from her hands was soft, almost timid at first, but full of feeling. It was the music of her childhood, the music of dreams she had never let go of, the music of a life that had been put on hold. She had learned to play piano as a child. Her parents had loved music and had encouraged her to practice every day. She had spent hours with her fingers on the keys, learning scales and melodies, imagining herself on stages and concert halls, sharing her music with the world. But life had a way of changing plans. Money was tight, responsibilities grew, and she had to make choices that left her dreams on the sidelines. Yet the piano remained, a quiet reminder that she was more than the work she did and the uniform she wore. It was her secret, her strength, and her joy. This morning was no different. She placed her bag carefully on the floor, sat down at the piano, and let her hands find the familiar keys. The notes filled the empty room, soft at first, growing more confident as she remembered the songs she had loved for years. She closed her eyes, letting the music take her away from the trays, the orders, and the tired faces. For a few precious moments, she was not a server. She was a musician, a storyteller, a person with a voice that could reach beyond the walls of this hotel. Her reverie was broken by the sound of the morning crowd arriving. Guests entered the lounge, their voices growing louder, their laughter and chatter filling the space. She took a deep breath and stood, wiping her hands on a clean towel, and returned to her duties. The music stayed with her, a quiet hum in the background. She carried trays, refilled glasses, and smiled at guests who never noticed the spark behind her eyes. She moved through the room like a ghost. It's always present but rarely seen. The hotel manager was strict, always watching, always expecting perfection. She had learned to anticipate his moods, to work efficiently, and to stay out of trouble. She knew the rules. The piano was off limits for staff, the lounge was for paying guests, and any deviation from her duties could mean a warning, or worse. Yet she could not ignore the call of the keys. It was a part of her, a part that refused to be silenced no matter how many hours she spent balancing trays and clearing tables. It was a quiet rebellion, a secret life that she carried within her, hidden from the world but alive in every note she played, and no one was watching. Her co-workers rarely spoke to her beyond what was necessary. Some envied her quiet strength, some ignored her completely. She had learned to be self-sufficient, to rely on herself for encouragement and comfort. She listened to their gossip from afar, smiled politely when addressed, and kept her own life separate. There were moments of loneliness, of course, when the weight of her responsibilities pressed down on her. But she had found a way to turn that loneliness into determination, a way to keep moving forward, to keep dreaming even when the world seemed determined to crush those dreams. As the day progressed, the lounge filled with guests for breakfast and brunch, she moved between tables, taking orders, refilling coffee, and ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Her movements were precise, practiced, and graceful, a dance she had learned through years of repetition. She noticed the details others overlooked: the way a guest's glass was smudged, the way a napkin was folded, the way a child's eyes lit up at a small gesture of kindness. She took pride in these moments, small as they were, because they reminded her that she mattered, that she could make a difference even in the smallest way. During a brief break, she slipped away to the piano once more. The lounge was quieter now, fewer guests at this hour, and she let her fingers glide over the keys. The music rose and fell, a gentle wave that carried her beyond the confines of her uniform and the expectations of others. She imagined herself on a stage, the audience hanging on every note, the applause ringing in her ears. It was a fantasy, of course, but it was a necessary one, a way to keep her spirit alive in a world that often seemed indifferent to her existence. She thought about her life, the choices she had made, and the sacrifices that had brought her here. There had been moments of doubt, of fear, of wondering whether it was all worth it. But every time her fingers touched the keys, she felt a sense of purpose, a reminder that she was more than her job, more than her circumstances. She carried that reminder with her as she returned to her duties, letting it guide her through the long hours and the demanding guests. The morning passed in a blur of activity. She served coffee, cleared plates, and answered questions with patience and grace. She listened to the conversations around her, the laughter, the arguments, the business deals being discussed over omelets and toast. She remained in the background, unnoticed, but attentive, absorbing everything and filing it away in her mind. She knew that one day someone would see her, would recognize the talent and strength she had hidden for so long. Until then, she would continue to work, to serve, and to play in the quiet moments when the world was not watching. By the time the morning rush ended, she was exhausted but fulfilled. She had done her job well, and the small victories of the day, the smiles of guests, the polite thanks, reminded her that her efforts mattered. She took a moment to sit at the piano again, letting her hands rest on the keys, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingers. The music came naturally, a comforting presence in her life, a reminder of who she was beyond the uniform and the trays. As she packed her bag to leave for the day, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had survived another morning, kept her secret life alive, and held on to her dreams. The hotel would see her only as a server, an invisible presence in the grand lounge. But she knew the truth. She was a musician, a dreamer, and a person who refused to be defined by the limitations others placed on her. And someday, the world would hear her, and they would understand that she was more than they had ever imagined. The afternoon shift began with a quiet tension in the air. The lounge was preparing for a corporate event, one of those gatherings that seemed larger than life. It's filled with people who measured themselves by power, money, and influence. She could feel it the moment she stepped onto the floor. The guests arrived in expensive cars, in tailored suits, and with confident smiles that did not reach their eyes. They moved through the room like they owned the world, speaking in loud voices and laughing at things that seemed small to anyone else. She carried her tray carefully, offering drinks and snacks with practiced politeness, her eyes catching every detail. Some of them barely noticed her. To them, she was part of the background, a server who existed only to meet their needs. She had grown used to it over the years. The world had taught her that attention was a luxury, one she could not afford to expect. She smiled when necessary, nodded when spoken to, and moved on when ignored. It was tiring, but she had learned to transform that exhaustion into focus, to use it as a shield against the indifference that surrounded her. She watched as the guests settled into their seats, talking about stock options, mergers, and deals that seemed far removed from the reality of her life. Their conversations were filled with jargon and numbers, and she listened politely while setting down trays and refilling glasses. Some of the executives glanced at her, offering brief, polite nods, but most ignored her completely. She felt invisible, yet she moved with a quiet confidence, knowing that being unnoticed did not make her weak. It made her patient. She took a moment to glance at the grand piano in the corner of the room. It gleamed under the soft lights, its polished wood catching the attention of anyone who cared to look. Normally, the piano was reserved for special occasions, and a professional pianist would have been scheduled to play for the event. But today, the pianist was late, and the staff had not received any updates. A few guests noticed the empty piano and shrugged, not caring much, assuming the music would come later. She felt a stir inside her, a mixture of longing and hesitation. She knew the rules. Staff were not supposed to touch the instrument. But she also knew that music could transform a room, change the mood, and perhaps even be a voice for those who were often unheard. The first half hour of the event was chaos. Servers moved quickly among the tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates, and offering small smiles that were often ignored. Some guests complained about delays, while others argued about seating arrangements or minor mistakes in the menu. The manager was tense, walking from table to table, issuing quiet but sharp instructions to the staff. She felt the pressure mounting around her, but remained focused. Her hands moved with precision, her mind calculating the quickest and most efficient way to meet the demands of the room. She balanced trays high above her head, dodged conversations, and kept track of multiple orders at once. Her body moved automatically, but her mind was elsewhere, thinking about the piano, the music, and the possibilities that lay just beyond reach. The clock ticked forward, and the expected pianist still had not arrived. A few guests began to murmur their frustration. One man, clearly important and used to being obeyed, complained loudly that the event felt incomplete without music. Another guest agreed, saying that the lack of a pianist was unprofessional and unexpected. The tension in the room grew, and she felt a familiar pull in her chest. She knew she could play. She had practiced in secret for years, and her hands knew the keys, as if they were extensions of her own body. But stepping forward would be risky. If the manager saw her, there could be consequences. Still, she could not ignore the emptiness of the room. The way the guests' moods had shifted from casual conversation to irritation. She took a deep breath and made a decision. She walked toward the piano slowly, trying not to draw attention to herself. A few guests noticed and frowned, whispering to one another, clearly assuming she had no right to touch the instrument. The manager was nearby, moving quickly to address a guest's complaint, and did not see her approach. She placed her hands on the keys and paused for a moment, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingers, listening to the quiet murmur of the room. Then, with a deep breath, she began to play. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, filling the room like a gentle breeze. Guests stopped speaking mid-sentence, their attention drawn instinctively to the sound. The music was simple at first, a melody that was familiar and comforting, yet it carried something more a depth that could not be explained by skill alone. It was the language of her life, the voice she had hidden behind trays and uniforms, now speaking loudly and clearly. Her fingers moved gracefully, finding the rhythm naturally, and soon the hesitancy was gone. The music flowed with confidence, rising and falling like waves, carrying emotion that could not be ignored. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Guests who had been complaining, frowning, or distracted now turned to listen. Their eyes widened slightly, their conversations halted, and their expressions softened. The room seemed to shrink around her, and yet in a strange way she felt expansive, free, and powerful. She had never played for such an audience before, and yet the music was effortless, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to be heard. She could feel the energy of the room, the subtle changes in mood. And she adjusted the tempo, the intensity, and the phrasing to suit the space. To speak to the people who had assumed she was nothing more than a server, a few people whispered to one another, clearly surprised by the unexpected performance. Some guests, who had barely noticed her before, now looked at her with curiosity and admiration. She ignored the glances, focusing entirely on the music, letting it carry her through the piece. Each note was a statement, a declaration of her presence and her talent. She was no longer invisible. She was seen, if only for a moment, by everyone in the room. The manager finally noticed, his eyes widening in shock as he saw her at the piano. He began to move toward her, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. But before he could say a word, the music carried on, filling the space with a richness and depth that silenced even his authority. The guests, previously irritated, were now leaning forward, listening intently, some with tears forming in the corners of their eyes. She played as if her life depended on it, pouring every ounce of feeling, every memory, every sacrifice into the keys. This was not about rules or fear. This was about expression. It's about claiming a moment of truth in a world that often tried to silence her. The piece came to a gentle close, and for a moment there was silence. The room held its breath, processing what had just happened. Then, slowly, applause began. It started as a few claps, uncertain and tentative, and grew into a wave of appreciation that echoed through the lounge. Guests who had previously ignored her were now standing, some with wide smiles, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The manager approached cautiously, unsure whether to scold or congratulate. And she met his gaze without fear, simply letting the music speak for itself. In that moment, she realized something profound. She had broken through the invisibility that had followed her for so long. She had reminded herself and everyone in the room that she was more than the uniform she wore, more than the work she did, and more than the expectations placed upon her. The piano had become a voice for her life, a voice that demanded to be heard, and it had succeeded. When the event resumed, the guests were still talking about the performance. Conversations were animated, but different now, infused with respect and curiosity. A few executives approached her, complimenting her skill, asking where she had learned to play. She smiled politely, answering briefly but honestly, letting the music be the main statement. The rest of the afternoon passed with a new energy. She continued her work as a server, but the room now looked at her differently. People noticed her presence, her attentiveness, and even her quiet confidence. For the first time in a long while, she felt that she belonged, not just as a worker, but as someone with value, talent, and a story to tell by the end of the day. When the guests had left and the lounge returned to its usual quiet, she sat at the piano once more. The empty room echoed with the memory of applause and astonished faces. She let her fingers rest on the keys, savoring the sensation and the reality of what had just happened. She was tired, more tired than she had been in weeks, but she was alive in a way that trays and orders could never give her. She knew the journey ahead would still be full of challenges, that the hotel would continue to see her as a server, that life would still require hard work and sacrifice. But for today, she had claimed a moment of recognition, a moment where she was seen for who she truly was, and that was enough to carry her forward. Into tomorrow, the evening air carried a strange sense of anticipation as she prepared for her next shift. Though the memory of the afternoon lingered in her mind, she could not ignore the reality that the hotel still saw her as nothing more than a server. She dressed carefully in her uniform, straightened her name tag, and tucked her hair behind her ears. The thought of returning to the piano filled her with excitement and nervousness. What she had done earlier had changed the room, even for a moment, but she knew it could not be her only chance. There were rules in place, expectations that could crush her if she overstepped, yet the music had awakened something inside her that she could not deny. When she arrived, the lounge was quiet, almost empty, with only a few early dinner guests settling in. The chandeliers reflected light across the polished floors, and the smell of fresh flowers mixed with the scent of fine cuisine. She picked up her first tray and moved among the tables, refilling water glasses and clearing crumbs, her hands steady, her smile polite. The guests paid her little attention, as expected, yet she noticed the subtle ways in which some watched her. A hand paused while writing a note. A conversation slowed for a moment. Eyes glanced in her direction before moving on. The afternoon's performance had left an impression, though small, and she felt it. The recognition, however limited, was enough to give her courage. As she moved toward the corner of the room where the piano stood, she took a deep breath and touched the keys lightly. The polished surface was cool against her fingertips, a familiar comfort. Tonight the piano would speak for her again. She hesitated for a moment, listening to the soft hum of conversation around her, then began to play. The notes were gentle at first, tentative, as if testing the room, feeling out its response. Slowly, the melody grew stronger, more confident. Weaving through the lounge and wrapping around the small group of diners present, conversations paused as guests turned to listen, their expressions softening, some smiling in surprise, others closing their eyes to absorb the music fully. Her fingers moved with a natural ease. Guided by years of practice and a lifetime of hidden longing, each note told a story she had never spoken aloud, a story of persistence, sacrifice, and the quiet strength that had carried her this far. The room seemed to shift, the energy transforming from casual dining into something almost sacred. Even the few guests who initially paid no attention were drawn in, feeling the music in a way that words could not express. She played not for recognition, though she welcomed it, but because she had to. The music was part of her, and without it, she felt incomplete. For the first time, she noticed the manager approaching from across the room. His expression was difficult to read, a mix of surprise, concern, and something else she could not identify. He had seen her in the act of playing, breaking the rule that forbade staff from touching the piano. She kept her focus on the keys, letting the music convey what words could not. His steps slowed as he listened, and she realized that even authority could be moved by honesty and talent. The melody carried through the space, rising and falling, gentle yet powerful. Commanding attention without demanding it, a young couple at a nearby table whispered to each other. Clearly impressed by her skill, the older man who had been grumbling earlier leaned back, his eyes wide, a small smile breaking across his face. One by one, the guests began to acknowledge her presence in a new way, a recognition that went beyond her uniform or her role. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mix of pride and relief. This was what she had been waiting for, the moment when her music could reach beyond herself and touch others. It was a quiet victory, the kind that did not announce itself loudly, but lingered in the heart. She continued to play, the notes carrying memories of her childhood, the lessons learned at her mother's knee, the evenings spent practicing when the world demanded otherwise. Each phrase of the melody was a testament to her perseverance, her dedication, and her refusal to be defined by circumstance. The room seemed to breathe with her, the sounds of cutlery and conversation fading into the background, leaving only the piano and the emotions it evoked. She felt the connection to her listeners, a silent understanding passing between them without words. For a brief moment, everyone was present in the same shared experience, united by music, and it was powerful as she finished the piece. The room remained quiet for a heartbeat longer, as if hesitant to break the spell. Then, slowly, applause began to build, gentle at first, then louder, echoing through the space. Some guests stood, their smiles wide, some whispered words of admiration. And the manager remained frozen for a moment, clearly processing what he had just witnessed. She rose from the piano, letting her fingers linger on the final notes, absorbing the effect of her performance. The applause continued, not just for the music, but for the courage it represented. She had stepped beyond fear and expectation, and the room had recognized her for it. Once the applause faded, the manager approached, his expression still a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. He spoke quietly, a careful balance between authority and curiosity. She answered politely, offering brief explanations of her training, careful not to overstep further. He listened, nodding occasionally, and for the first time, she sensed a glimmer of respect. The guests had noticed the room had shifted. She felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her music had altered perception, even if only slightly. The evening continued with a new energy. Guests approached her, asking questions, offering compliments, and expressing surprise at her skill. She answered with humility, aware that she had stepped into a world that had previously ignored her. Each interaction reinforced the realization that talent and courage could not remain hidden forever. The music had opened a door, and she stepped through it carefully, aware of both the possibilities and the responsibilities that came with recognition throughout the night. She returned to her regular duties, serving food and drinks, clearing tables, and maintaining the professional composure expected of her. Yet the atmosphere had changed. Guests now saw her, if only partially, as someone with depth and capability. She moved among them with the same skill and grace, but with an added confidence, a sense of self that had been quietly building for years. Even the younger servers seemed to notice, casting glances of curiosity and admiration. She felt a subtle pride, not in herself alone, but in the proof that persistence, practice, and quiet determination could alter the way the world saw someone. Later, when the lounge emptied and the guests departed, she lingered by the piano. The echoes of the evening's applause and the amazed expressions of the diners still resonated in the room. She allowed herself to sit once more, running her fingers over the keys in gentle reflection. The music was softer now, a personal conversation between herself and the instrument. She thought about how far she had come, the sacrifices she had made, and the moments of doubt she had overcome. The piano had become more than a tool or a secret. It was a witness, a companion, and a bridge to the life she had always imagined. She realized that recognition did not come easily, and that moments like tonight were precious. Yet she also understood that the true power lay not in the applause or the surprise of the guests, but in the courage to act when the opportunity presented itself. Music had given her that chance, and she had embraced it fully. It was a lesson that would carry her forward, guiding her choices, fueling her determination, and reminding her that her worth could not be measured solely by the uniform she wore or the tasks she performed. As she prepared to leave for the night, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Her body was tired from hours of standing, serving, and moving quickly among the tables, but her spirit was alive in a way it had not been for a long time. She carried with her the knowledge that she had been seen, if only for a moment, for who she truly was. The piano had allowed her to speak without words, to reveal her hidden strength, and to command attention in a world that often overlooked those who served quietly in the background. Walking home, she reflected on the day, replaying the melodies in her mind and the expressions of those who had listened. She knew there would be challenges ahead. The hotel and the world beyond it would continue to impose limits and expectations. Yet she felt ready, fortified by the experience, and determined to continue pursuing both her duties and her dreams. The music had proven to her, and to those who had witnessed it, that greatness could exist in unexpected places, and that talent could emerge even where it had been overlooked by the time she reached her apartment. The city lights glowing softly around her, she felt a quiet sense of hope. She prepared for rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of work, another chance to serve, and perhaps another moment to play. The piano had changed something inside her, reminding her that even in a world that often ignored her, she had a voice, a talent, and a story that was waiting to be heard. And as she lay down to sleep, she allowed herself a smile, knowing that the journey was only beginning, and that the music inside her would continue to guide every step she took. The next morning, she woke up with the faint ache of muscles she didn't know she had, and the lingering thrill of the previous evening. The memory of applause and astonished faces carried her through the morning routine, a quiet smile forming on her lips as she got ready. She dressed in her uniform carefully, aware that the day would bring another round of service, but also hopeful that the world might see her in a slightly different light. She ate a quick breakfast, gathering the energy she would need for the long hours ahead. Her apartment was still quiet, the city humming softly outside, but inside her there was a sense of anticipation that she had not felt in years. Arriving at the hotel, she was met with the usual bustle. The staff moved like clockwork, each person performing their duties with efficiency and routine. Guests trickled in, some familiar, some new, all absorbed in their own worlds. She picked up a tray and moved through the lobby, offering polite greetings and attentive service. Yet, there was a subtle shift in the air. A few guests recognized her from yesterday, their eyes lighting up briefly as they nodded or whispered comments to one another. She carried herself with an extra quiet confidence, knowing that her presence was now noted, even if only in small ways. The piano in the corner of the lounge gleamed invitingly, reminding her of the power it held and the impact she could make with it. The day unfolded with the usual demands of service-taking orders, balancing trays, refilling drinks, and clearing plates. She worked efficiently, keeping her mind alert for every small detail. Each guest's expression, posture, and tone told a story, and she absorbed them all, responding with care and patience. The afternoon brought a corporate event, even larger than the previous day, with more guests, louder conversations, and higher expectations. The air was thick with energy, excitement, and tension. She moved among the tables with practiced grace, aware that any small misstep could be noticed. Yet, beneath the routine, there was a pulse of possibility. A chance for another moment where she could let her music speak. The scheduled pianist was late again, and murmurs of dissatisfaction spread among the guests. Some complained quietly, while others expressed frustration more openly, their voices carrying across the room. She felt the familiar tug in her chest, a mixture of fear and excitement. The rules were clear. Staff were not allowed to play the piano. Yet the longing she felt was stronger than her fear. She had discovered the power of her music, and she could not ignore it. She glanced around, making sure the manager was occupied with other matters, then moved toward the piano. As her fingers touched the keys, she felt the familiar cool surface beneath her fingertips. She paused for a moment, listening to the chatter and clinking of glasses around her. Then, slowly, she began to play. The notes were gentle at first, delicate and precise, carrying a sense of anticipation. The melody unfolded gradually, weaving through the room like a thread of calm amidst the chaos. Guests turned toward her, curiosity replacing irritation. Some whispered to one another, surprised that a server could play with such skill and emotion. Others leaned back in their chairs, allowing themselves to be carried by the music, their eyes closing briefly as they absorbed the sound. Her confidence grew as she continued. The hesitancy of the first notes disappeared, replaced by a flow of emotion and technical skill that commanded attention. Each phrase was deliberate, each chord chosen to reach the hearts of those listening. She played from memory, from intuition, from the deep well of practice and experience that had been hidden for years. The room transformed around her. The corporate chatter faded into the background, replaced by a shared focus on the music. Even the staff paused in their movements, quietly observing. Amazed by what was unfolding, the manager noticed her almost immediately, his expression one of disbelief and concern. He moved toward her, clearly unsure whether to intervene or allow the performance to continue. She did not look up, her attention fixed entirely on the piano. The music had a life of its own, and in that moment, she became fully present in the melody, letting it carry her beyond the boundaries of her role. The guests responded instinctively, some sitting in silent awe, others leaning forward, drawn into the emotion she expressed without words. Her music spoke of resilience, patience, and quiet strength, all qualities that had gone unnoticed in the uniform she wore daily. As the piece progressed, she noticed subtle changes in the room. The once restless guests were now attentive, their irritation forgotten. Some who had complained moments before now whispered words of admiration to one another, their faces lighting up with recognition. The transformation was not immediate for everyone, but it was tangible. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her actions had altered perception and created a moment of connection between strangers. If only briefly, the final notes lingered in the air, soft and lingering, and for a heartbeat. There was silence. Then the applause began, tentative at first, building into a wave of appreciation. Guests rose from their seats, clapping and smiling, some with tears glistening in their eyes. Even the manager stood frozen for a moment, his authority tempered by genuine surprise and admiration. She rose from the piano, breathing deeply, her hands tingling from the intensity of the performance. The recognition was not just for the skill she displayed, but for the courage it represented. She had stepped beyond fear and expectation and emerged victorious. Not in a loud or boastful way, but with quiet dignity and undeniable talent. After the applause, the manager approached cautiously, his expression softening as he spoke. He asked about her training, her experience, and how she had learned to play. She answered with humility, explaining briefly without exaggeration, letting the performance itself speak louder than any words. Guests continued to approach, offering compliments and expressing amazement. Some even asked for recommendations or advice, recognizing her as someone extraordinary, despite her role as a server. The room buzzed with a new energy, one that respected her presence and talent in ways that had not existed before. She returned to her duties, clearing tables and refilling drinks, but everything had shifted. Guests now acknowledged her with smiles and nods. The younger servers watched her with quiet admiration, and even the manager seemed more considerate of her efforts. The day passed with a rhythm that was both familiar and changed, the usual tasks imbued with a sense of purpose and validation. She moved efficiently, aware of the subtle shift in perception, and carried herself with newfound confidence. Each interaction reinforced the lesson she had learned. Talent and courage could not remain hidden forever, and those who were often overlooked still held power in unexpected ways. As the evening drew to a close, she returned to the piano one last time. The room was empty, echoing with the faint memory of applause and astonished expressions. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, letting the music flow softly, a personal reflection on the day's events. She thought about the impact she had made, the recognition she had received, and the small but significant changes in how others viewed her. The piano had become more than an instrument. It was a bridge to the world she had longed to participate in, a voice for the dreams and ambitions she had hidden for so long. She sat in quiet contemplation, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The work, the rules, and the daily routine had not changed, but her perception of herself and her place in the world had shifted. She knew the journey ahead would still be full of challenges, that the hotel and the world beyond would continue to impose limitations, and that recognition could be fleeting. Yet the experience had strengthened her, reminding her that her voice and her talent mattered, that her courage could create change, and that her dreams were valid and achievable. Walking home under the soft glow of the city lights, she carried the memory of the evening with her. She reflected on the faces of the guests, expressions of admiration and surprise, and the quiet satisfaction of having embraced her talent when opportunity knocked. Each step reinforced her determination to continue pursuing her music alongside her work, to nurture the part of herself that refused to be silent. She understood that her life would always require balance, resilience, and hard work. But she also knew that she had found a way to assert her presence, to claim her voice, and to inspire recognition. Even in unexpected places, at home, she prepared for rest, her body weary, but her spirit invigorated. She lay down, replaying the melodies in her mind, feeling the lingering echoes of the applause and the connection she had forged with those who had listened. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of possibility and the sense that her life was beginning to expand beyond the boundaries of expectation. She had stepped forward, embraced her talent, and made the world pause, if only briefly, to see her as she truly was. And in that pause, she found a quiet but profound sense of empowerment, one that would carry her through the days, the music, and the life that awaited her. The morning after the event, she woke with a strange sense of anticipation, her body tired, but her mind alive with possibility. The memories of the previous evening, the music, the faces of the guests, the manager's astonishment lingered vividly. She knew today would be like any other day in terms of her duties, but she also carried a new awareness of herself and her place in the world. Dressing in her uniform, she adjusted her name tag with care, her movements more deliberate, more confident. She had discovered something powerful within herself, and it shaped the way she carried herself as she stepped out into the morning light. The hotel buzzed with activity when she arrived. Guests were checking out, new arrivals were arriving, and the staff moved in synchronized motion, each aware of the tasks to be completed. She picked up her tray and began her rounds, serving drinks and clearing tables with her usual efficiency. Yet everything felt slightly different. The guests who had been part of the corporate event whispered among themselves, nodding at her or casting subtle smiles. Even those who had not witnessed her playing seemed to sense a quiet authority in her presence. She moved among them with the same grace and attentiveness. But now there was an inner certainty that had not been there before. She was no longer invisible, and she carried herself accordingly. The afternoon brought a new event, another gathering of influential people. The lounge filled quickly, the atmosphere charged with anticipation and expectation. She moved through the crowd, her tray balanced expertly, her attention on every detail. Conversations and laughter swirled around her, but her focus remained sharp. She noticed subtle shifts in the room. A guest paused mid-conversation to glance at her. Another leaned back in appreciation as her presence passed by. The recognition was quiet but present, a reminder that her actions had created a ripple effect beyond her immediate awareness. She felt a sense of calm strength, understanding that her place in the room had changed, and that this shift could grow if she continued to act with courage and purpose. Once the pianist again failed to arrive on time, murmurs of frustration began to surface. Some guests expressed irritation, while others simply assumed there would be no music. She felt the familiar pull in her chest, the blend of fear and excitement that came with stepping beyond her expected role. She glanced around, noticing that the manager was occupied with a complaint from a guest, and she made her decision. With a deep breath, she moved toward the piano. Her hands hovered above the keys for a moment, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingers. Then, slowly, she began to play. The music flowed effortlessly, a continuation of the story she had begun in previous performances. The melody was rich with emotion, carrying the essence of her life experiences, the sacrifices she had made, and the quiet determination that had defined her. Guests paused, turning toward the piano, their expressions shifting from impatience to curiosity, and then to awe. Conversations died down as the sound enveloped the room, a gentle yet commanding presence that could not be ignored. Each note spoke of resilience, of hidden strength, and of a talent that had been patiently waiting for recognition.